The gorilla-sized man set my suitcase down in the foyer of my dead father's house. Diane froze on the staircase, her silk robe clutched at her throat. "What are you doing here?" she hissed. Paul Briggs shouldered past her without a word. "She lives here," he said flatly. "If you didn't know." Upstairs, Danny was already cramming silverware into a duffel bag. I stood in the doorway of my childhood home, hands trembling, not from fear anymore, but from 9 years of silence finally breaking. Something hot climbed through my ribs, a pressure I hadn't felt since the night someone's hands closed around my throat in that hotel room. But this time the heat didn't scatter into panic. It collected. It hardened. I watched Diane's mouth open and close, her collagen lips forming words I couldn't hear over the blood drumming in my ears. She smelled the way she always did. That thick, sweet perfume layered over something chemical and wrong, like air freshener sprayed over a drain. Her fingernails, cherry red and pointed, dug into the banister. The silk robe she wore was my mother's shade of ivory, but the fabric was wrong, too shiny. A costume of elegance rather than the thing itself. Behind her, the house was different. My mother's watercolors had been replaced with oversized prints of Tuscan vineyards in gilded frames that caught the hallway light and threw cheap gold reflections across the ceiling. The oak floors I'd learned to walk on were buried under white carpet that already showed wine stains near the baseboards and a faint gray track leading from the kitchen. She had redecorated my father's life the way she redecorated his home, covering everything real with something cheaper and louder. Danny appeared at the top of the stairs, a pillowcase bulging with what I would later learn was my mother's jewelry collection. He froze when he saw Paul Briggs, the way a raccoon freezes in headlights. Not with guilt but with the animal calculation of whether to bolt or bite. But to understand how I ended up standing in that foyer with a bodyguard and a court order in my bag, you'd have to go back about 5 years. Back to when I was nobody. Back to when I wanted to be nobody. For 5 years I had been a janitor at Anderson & Sullivan Commercial Development in Greenville, South Carolina. I wore shapeless navy coveralls 2 sizes too large, a bandana pulled low over my eyebrows, and yellow rubber gloves that I never removed in front of anyone. The gloves were my second skin, cracked at the fingertips, stiff with bleach, molded to the shape of my grip on the mop handle. I was invisible and I had designed it that way. People walked into me in the hallways like I was a piece of furniture someone had left in the wrong spot. They stepped on my feet without apology. I never corrected them. I never spoke unless the situation absolutely demanded it, and even then I kept my eyes on the linoleum. I mopped. I emptied trash cans. I wiped fingerprints off glass doors and polished the brass elevator trim until it burned gold under the fluorescent tubes. I learned every person's schedule in that building. Who left early, who stayed late, who hid liquor in their desk drawer. I noticed everything because noticing everything is what kept me alive. I could tell by the angle of a coffee ring on a conference table whether a meeting had gone well or badly. I knew the security code for the storage room, the cleaning schedule of the building management company, and which bathroom stall had a broken lock that nobody reported for 3 months because nobody wanted to be the person who admitted they'd noticed. I was so good at disappearing that sometimes I startled myself in the restroom mirror. Who is that thin woman with the hollow cheeks and the posture of someone expecting to be hit? That was the point. If no one saw me, no one could find me. And there was someone I very much did not want to be found by. The story of how I became a ghost starts in Scottsdale, Arizona, in a house with terracotta walls and a pool that caught the sunset like a bowl of liquid copper. My father, Warren Whitfield, built that house the year I was born. He was a real estate man. Not flashy, not loud, just relentless and patient, the kind who'd drive a property line in his truck at dawn before anyone else was awake. My mother died when I was 11. Ovarian cancer, fast and merciless, diagnosed in April and buried in September. After she was gone, my father orbited her absence like a satellite that lost its planet. He still set her place at dinner for months. Nana Jenny, his housekeeper, my surrogate grandmother, would quietly clear the plate after he went to bed, and she'd press her knuckle to the bridge of her nose to keep from crying. 3 years later he met Diane. She appeared at a charity gala in Phoenix wearing a dress the exact shade of blue my mother used to favor. Her hair was the same honey brown, cut to the same length. She tilted her head when she listened the same way. I was 19 and I saw it immediately, saw how she'd studied my mother's photographs, copied her gestures, maybe even had work done on her nose and chin to close the gap. My stomach knotted the first time she touched my father's arm. Something cold and slippery moved through my gut. The feeling you get when you open a door and smell gas but can't locate the leak. I told my father. I begged him to be careful. Diane intercepted every attempt. She'd find me alone and her face would change. The warm smile would flatten into something lizard still, and she'd speak in a low, measured voice that left no fingerprints. I know this is hard for you, sweetheart. Losing your mother. Seeing someone new in her place. I understand completely. She made it sound like my grief was the sickness and she was the cure. Within 8 months they were married. Within a year, she'd convinced my father that the best thing for my future was a top-tier education in Vancouver. Far from Arizona, far from her. He paid for everything. He called it love. He said, "Your mother and I only want the best for you." And the word mother in Diane's mouth made my throat close like an allergic reaction. I don't have a mother, I told him. She died. And now I'm losing my father too. Diane pressed a tissue to her perfectly lined eye and whispered to him, "You see? No matter what I do, I'll always be the villain." He chose her. I boarded a plane to Vancouver with one suitcase and a hollowed-out chest. Nana Ginny drove me to the airport and held my face in her flour-dusted hands. "You come home the second you can, you hear me? I don't trust that woman further than I can spit." Promised I would. 9 years. That's how long Diane kept me out. My father wired money, sent birthday texts, called on Christmas with a voice that grew thinner each year like a radio signal fading. He visited Danny's mother, because Danny was not my father's son, though I wouldn't learn that until much later, 7 times a year, flying back and forth like it was nothing. He never once flew to Vancouver to see me. Diane controlled the narrative the way she controlled everything. Softly, with a smile, with phrases like "she needs her independence," and "we have to let her grow." Nana Ginny told me over the phone that he'd started taking heart medication, that his color was bad, that Diane controlled his meals and his pills and his calendar with the attentiveness of a nurse and the precision of a chemist. Then one day Nana Ginny stopped calling. I found out weeks later that Diane had fired her, replaced her with a stranger, a young woman who answered my calls with a clipped "he's resting," and hung up before I could say his name. The last set of honest eyes in that house had been removed. I wanted to fly home. I almost booked the flight twice. But by then I was 28 and something inside me had calcified into a shape I barely recognized. The fear was no longer sharp. It had become architecture, load-bearing walls and locked doors and a crawl space where I kept everything I used to be. It was the scaffolding I'd built my invisible life around, and pulling one beam out meant the whole structure would collapse on top of me. So I stayed invisible. I cleaned offices. I kept my mouth shut. And I waited, though I couldn't have told you what I was waiting for. The thing that cracked my invisible life open was not courage. It was an accident. One evening at 6:30, I was mopping the floor in Paul Anderson's corner office. The building had mostly emptied out, just the hum of the central air and the distant tick of the parking garage gate rising and falling. Paul had already left for the day. I had his office to myself, which was the only time I felt something close to peace, alone with the lemon scent of floor cleaner and the wide window that overlooked the highway. Then the elevator chimed. Paul walked back in mid-sentence with Victor Sullivan, his deputy and oldest friend, their voices tight with a problem I could feel before I understood it. "We've got the Chinese delegation arriving tomorrow morning, Vic, and our Mandarin translator is in a hospital bed with a bleeding ulcer. The translation bureau 5 floors up is useless. Their guy botched our last contract so badly it read like it was run through a free app. This isn't a text job. This is live, synchronous negotiation. If we can't communicate, we lose the deal." Victor rubbed his temples with thick fingers. They hadn't noticed me. Nobody ever noticed me. I straightened up from my bucket and the words left my mouth before the invisible woman inside me could clamp them shut. "I speak Mandarin," I said. "Fluently. I can do your simultaneous translation." Victor's face twisted like he'd bitten into something rotten. "The janitor. You're listening to the janitor, Paul." But Paul Anderson looked at me, really looked at me, for the first time in 5 years. He picked up his phone and called his associate George Chan overseas. He handed me the phone. I peeled off my rubber glove and took it. My fingers were pale, the skin soft beneath the cracked yellow latex. I spoke to George Chun for 4 minutes in Mandarin conversational, then technical, then because something reckless and joyful surged through me, I quoted a line of classical poetry that made him laugh out loud. When I handed the phone back, Paul's eyebrows were somewhere near his hairline. George Chen's verdict came through the speaker. Flawless, native level, extraordinary. Victor's mouth was still hanging open when Paul turned to me and said, "Get changed. We're going shopping." He took me to a boutique downtown. The fluorescent lights of the fitting room buzzed against my skull as I stood in front of a full-length mirror in a steel gray silk blouse and a fitted charcoal skirt that hit just below the knee. I did not recognize the woman staring back. She had cheekbones. She had posture. She had eyes that looked like they belonged to someone who had once known how to be alive. The price tag on the blouse alone was more than my monthly paycheck, and when I flinched, Paul shook his head. "This is a business expense. Tomorrow you represent the firm. The firm does not show up in rubber gloves." The negotiations went flawlessly. By the following week I had a new title, a new desk, and a new problem. I needed identification documents to complete my employment paperwork. And I had none. Diane had made sure of that. When I told Paul the truth, not all of it, just enough, his face went very still. He called in his head of security, a man named Paul Briggs, who filled a doorframe the way a refrigerator fills a kitchen. Briggs ran a background check that took less than 48 hours and came back with a story uglier than anything I had dared to tell. My father was dead. He had died of cardiac arrest 3 weeks after checking himself out of the hospital against medical advice, alone in the house with Diane and her son. Before he died, he had managed 2 things. He filed for divorce and he rewrote his will. Every cent, every property, every asset mine. Diane knew. She had been bluffing for months, telling anyone who asked that Warren left everything to her, banking on the assumption that I would never come back to check. My hands went numb when Briggs told me. The room tilted. I gripped the edge of my new desk. The wood was cool and smooth and utterly indifferent to the fact that my father had died believing I hated him. That was her masterpiece. Not the money. Not the house. She had stolen the last years of a dying man's love for his daughter, and she had done it with a smile and a bottle of perfume that smelled like my mother. The gorilla-sized man set my suitcase down in the foyer of my dead father's house. Diane froze on the staircase. I had rehearsed this moment 100 times in the weeks since Briggs handed me the folder, but rehearsal doesn't prepare you for the smell. Her perfume hit me first, that cloying sweetness, and beneath it the staleness of a house where windows haven't been opened in months. The curtains were drawn. The air was thick and warm and wrong like the inside of a mouth. My hands were trembling but my voice was steady. "I'm home," I said. Paul Briggs walked in behind me and everything in her face rearranged itself, the practiced grief collapsing into something feral and cornered. Danny appeared at the top of the stairs with a pillowcase bulging with what I already knew was my mother's jewelry. He stopped cold. I looked at Diane and I saw her clearly for the first time. Not the phantom of my mother she'd constructed, not the elegant widow she performed for my father's colleagues, but the animal underneath. The dye job was growing out at the roots. The skin around her jaw had that tight, waxy sheen of too many procedures. Her hands, gripping the banister, were the hands of someone calculating how fast she could reach the back door. I felt the years compress, the airport goodbye, the empty Vancouver apartment, the night someone's fingers closed around my throat in the dark, and all of it funneled into this single moment in this foyer where I had once learned to walk. I was not the invisible woman anymore. I was the daughter who came back. "You have no right to be here," Diane said, and her voice cracked on the word right. I opened my bag. Not the suitcase, the leather messenger bag I had carried on my shoulder, the one Paul Anderson's legal team had packed for me 3 days earlier. The thing Diane did not know, the thing I had spent 3 weeks building while she redecorated my father's study and drained his secondary accounts, was this. Before I set foot in that house, I had Briggs file a formal complaint with the Scottsdale Police Department documenting the attempted strangulation at the hotel, cross-referenced with cell tower records that placed Danny's phone in the hotel parking lot that same night. I had Paul Anderson's attorney subpoena pharmacy records showing Diane had been purchasing a cardiac glycoside compound in quantities that dwarfed any legitimate prescription, the same compound that, according to the toxicology addendum Briggs quietly requested on my father's autopsy, was present in his bloodstream at levels consistent with chronic poisoning. And I had done one more thing that Diane would not discover until the following morning. I had contacted every real estate agent, banker, and investment broker my father had ever worked with and presented my certified documents. Every account she'd been siphoning from was frozen before I rang the doorbell. I pulled 3 documents from the bag and held them out to her. A certified copy of my father's will naming me sole heir, a restraining order effective immediately, and a printed summary of the evidence file already forwarded to the Maricopa County District Attorney. You have 24 hours to leave this house, I said. If anything is missing when you go, it gets added to the theft charges. And if either of you contacts me again, the attempted murder investigation goes from open to active. Danny dropped the pillowcase. It hit the tile floor with a muffled clink of gold and silver. Diane's mouth opened and closed without sound, her collagen lips working around words that wouldn't form. They were gone by sunrise. I brought Nana Ginny home the following week. Briggs drove to Sarasota himself, loaded her single suitcase and her cast-iron skillet into the truck, and she talked his ear off for the entire 9-hour drive back. When she walked through the front door, she stood in that same foyer and pressed both hands to her cheeks and wept. "Oh, your father's house," she said. "It smells wrong. We're going to fix that." She opened every window. She threw out Diane's candles and her potpourri and her heavy drapes and replaced them with nothing, just the dry desert air rolling in, carrying dust and sage and the faint sweetness of creosote after rain. That night she made pancakes with maple syrup, stacking them on the old blue plate my mother had bought at a yard sale decades ago. The one with the chip on the rim that nobody ever threw away because it held the shape of 1,000 family breakfasts. Paul Briggs sat at the kitchen island looking vaguely terrified of the tiny woman who kept piling food on his plate. "More," Nana Ginny said, pointing her spatula at him. "A man your size needs fuel." He ate 6 pancakes without complaint. I sat across from them and felt something shift behind my sternum. Something warm and startled, like a bird that had been trapped behind glass for years and suddenly found the window open. The white carpet was already torn out. Underneath, the original oak floors were scratched and dull, but they were real, and they were mine. The whole house was mine. The name was mine. The silence was mine. Not the hunted silence of a woman hiding in a janitor's coveralls, but the deep, clean quiet of someone who has finally come home and locked the door from the inside. Not out of fear, but because she can. I ran my thumb along the chipped rim of my mother's blue plate and I thought about my father, and I forgave him and I went to bed. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I hope it moved you the way it moved me to tell it. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe so you don't miss the next one, and share your own life experiences in the comments below. I always read them, and your stories matter just as much. If you could rate this story from 1 to 10, I'd truly appreciate it. Until next time, take care of yourselves.